Briefing session. It being the allotted time, or 1 minute past 6 o'clock, I'll declare this meeting open. As you may know, the briefing session occurs once a month, a week in advance of the council meeting. This briefing session is not a decision-making forum, but rather an opportunity for councillors to ask questions and seek further clarification on items listed in the agenda. Kaya Maman, Kaya Yoga, Kaya Bridie, Yananuk, Nalak Karij Winji Alak Nini, Nalak Karij Nija Buja Bal, Wajak Nunga Buja Lalak Nini, Kura, Nijie Burawan. On behalf of the town of Bassendean, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land on which we meet, the Wajak people of the Noongar Nation. May their campfires burn forever. I would also like to remind people that our meetings are recorded and live streamed and also uploaded to the town's website. We'll go on to attendances, apologies. Now we have a few apologies tonight. We have Mr. Phil Adams, who is Manager of Infrastructure. He is absent tonight. Ms. Mabs, the CEO, is absent tonight, as is Councillor Wilding. And do we have any other absences tonight? No, I know of. Okay. Declarations of interest. Councillors, do we have any declarations of interest tonight?
I've got a query.
Yes, Councillor.
Thanks. About bin dairying, sorry, and can I address this to you, Luke? Is it my understanding is that all the lots are still separate lots within the public open space of bin dairying swamp, bin dairying park area?
Typically, yes. It's not one consolidated parcel. It's made up of a series of parcels.
So, given that, I don't have an interest in that item. Thank you.
Okay, councillors, item 4 is announcements. I'd just like to announce that the new draft local planning strategy will be advertised for a period of 1 month, commencing on the 22nd of July. Since Council's previous consideration of the draft strategy in November 2020, that was the culmination of the Bassendean community engagement, the document has been significantly amended as to align with the feedback and direction of the Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage. I would encourage residents to review the amended strategy and to provide your feedback in late July through to early August. Thank you. I believe the information will be on the town's website. Mr. Gibson?
Through Madam Mayor, yes, as of this Friday morning.
There are no petitions that I know of? No? Okay. So we move on to public statement time. Now I have several statements that have been sent through by email and on the town's website. So I'll read those first before I open up statement and question time to the audience. The first statement is from Fiona and Ian Cook of 40 Harcourt Street, Bassendean, referencing item 8.1, draft local planning scheme 11, our support for a number of issues as follows, as we are unable to attend the meeting. 1, that 17 and 19 Anstey Street are returned to Park Reserve and not to remove 21 and 23 Anstey as public open space. 2, prevent sections of Highland, Carnegie and Anstey being removed from the reserve in support of road closures of Harcourt, Carnegie and Forfar Road. We believe it is imperative that everything possible is done to preserve Bindaring wetland in its entirety for future generations. There are some people who've sent in statements who are in the audience, so I've asked them and they will read out their statements personally. We go on to Leah Kenyon of 15 Anstey Road, Bassendean, also item 8.1. I'm a local resident writing this statement to contest lots numbers 21 and 23 Anstey Road, Bassendean being rezoned to residential and for lots number 17 and 19 to be returned to public open space. I am a homeowner on Anstey Road, and my family, along with many of my neighbours and the Bassendean community, utilise this public open space daily. This space of Bindaring Park is not only a beautiful natural area where my children play, but is also home to some of Bassendean's most beautiful wildlife. I will paraphrase some of these statements because some of them are quite long. We only have a few minutes for each one. My final concern I will voice is that this land is also a natural soak well, and the risk of flooding is going to increase drastically if we take this away. We are in close proximity to the river, and in the event of any future flooding of this land, it will no longer support heavy rainfall, and our risk increases if this natural area is built upon. Okay. Linda Stewart, this is in respect to item 8.2. Oh, sorry, I didn't see you there, Linda. Okay, thank you. Gavin Ingram. Okay, so Gavin is of 20 Highland Street, also 8.2, proposed road closures Bindaring Park. With reference to briefing session 19th of July, the proposed closure of public road reserve portions of Harcourt Street, Carnegie Road and Bindaring Park marked in lime green on the diagram. This proposal makes sense, and I fully support those areas amalgamated into the park. The rezoning of sections of Anstey Road, Carnegie and Highland Streets marked in blue, I am opposed to this proposal. These areas should remain as parks and recreation as intended under Town Planning Scheme 4A. As a resident of Highland Street for over 25 years, I have not seen any issues with the current zoning in these areas. As it stands at the moment, the current zoning allows for future change and improvement. Rezoning would restrict any future change, and it is not the intention of Town Planning Scheme 4A. It is extremely important that the parks and recreation areas be protected so as to maintain our natural environment. Gentleman also goes on to speak about the town-owned lots in Anstey Road. These blocks are low-lying and prone to flooding. This area provides a catchment for local drainage. The area is also a habitat for natural wildlife and trees. A change of all 4 lots to public open space is preferable. And Sophie and James Goldsmith, 79 Whitfield Street. Also 8.2, I have lived my whole life in Bassendean. The Bindaring wetland where I once played and walked has been gradually chipped away over the years. This must stop. It is pure negligence to disregard the importance of wetlands in the ecosystem. Plus the river, parks and wetlands are the main lure for residents wishing to live in this wonderful suburb. I therefore propose 1, that numbers 21 and 23 Anstey Street remain as Park Reserve, and numbers 17 and 19 Anstey Street are returned to Park Reserve. 2, I believe Highland, Carnegie and Anstey must remain as part of the reserve. My husband and I are very much in support of the closure of Carnegie, Warfare Road and part of Harcourt Street. Now, there were a large number of questions sent by another resident, Mr. Ross Minette, and I have the understanding that the staff, the officers, are going to provide written responses to that particular person. There are far too many questions to read out and answer tonight. So I'll now invite you to put up your hand if you wish to make a statement, state your name and address and come to the microphone. So who would like to make a statement? So gentlemen.
Microphone here.
Yes, sir.
Madam Mayor, councillors, my name's Greg Derui. I live at 7 Carnegie Road, Bassendean. I've been a resident of Bassendean around 20 years, and I'm thinking this is about the 4th or the 5th time that I'm doing this same deputation about this proposed rezoning of the lots in Anstey Road. The first point I'd like to make is that every other time that I've been up here, there has been unanimously the community have voted this down and voted against this. So it keeps coming back to council, but every time I've been here, it's been unanimous that no one has thought this proposal was a good idea, and the whole of the community are against this. That's the first point. The second point is obviously, and it will be made many, many times, this is part of a wetland. Wetlands are a very fragile ecosystem, lots of fauna, flora, wildlife there, and there's some significant trees also on these lots. So I think, just to quote from your strategic plan point 2.1, a beautiful natural environment with an abundance of vegetation, trees, green open space, and connection to the Swan River are highly valued by our community. We are already making positive enhancements to our natural environment and our leaders in this area. I don't think rezoning public open space to residential land in a floodplain area fits with that strategic vision. So that's another point I'd like to make. And I guess it's really important that we have the opportunity to reunite the wetland, which point has already been made by Gavin. So I would be opposed again to the rezoning of the roads to road reserve, but I think a really good idea, so this doesn't keep happening every year, is to rezone the other two lots, I think it's 21 and 23, to be reunited with the parkland, reunite the whole park back together, give the community what it wants, preserve the environment, and actually live up to the value statement that you made in your strategic plan.
Thank you. Just to clarify, in the draft scheme that is in 8.1, the current status of the land lots is that 2 of them are public open space and 2 are residential. So, Mr. Gibson, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Madam Mayor. As Madam Mayor has said, under the current local planning scheme, properties number 21 and 23 are reserved as local open space. Properties number 17 and 19 are zoned residential R25. Just for the avoidance of any doubt going forward, the proposal at item 8.1, being draft local planning scheme number 11, is not proposing to change that. So in terms of a purported rezoning, that is simply not the case. As it relates to the Anstey Street lots, the proposed scheme simply seeks to carry through the existing local planning scheme number 10 zonings and reservations.
Okay.
Are we able to ask the residents questions on the interpretations? No.
No. Sorry, councillor. Okay, the next resident who would like to speak with a statement.
Good evening, my name is Colin Davies and I'm from 15 Anstey Road. Please bear with me, I'm going to read this from my phone. Okay. As the owner of 15 Anstey Road and as a principal environmental scientist, I strongly contest any notion to rezone lots 21 and 23 Anstey Road to residential and strongly advocate for lots 17 and 19 Anstey Road to be returned to public open space. I understand that under draft local planning scheme number 11, options remain to have all 4 lots designated as public open space, an option which is supported and advocated by the local residents fervently. Furthermore, our visual amenity will be directly and significantly impacted by any future construction, as well as the social surroundings enjoyed by many local residents and those further afield, past and present. Further to this, Part 9, Subclause H of the draft local planning scheme number 11 stipulates that one of the primary aims of the aforementioned scheme is to protect and enhance natural environment, in particular urban bushland, river environs and urban canopy. Zoning all or any of the subject lots on Anstey Road contravenes this aim and does not align with the fundamentals of sustainable development, which is one of 7 priority areas, and I quote, leading environmental sustainability, adopted by the town of Bassendean in July 2020 as part of the strategic community plan. Whilst I recognise that the plan is a strategic and high-level one, the ultimate intention is to robustly demonstrate the town's intention to honour the principles of the, this I quote, one planet living framework and deliver a town that is a green and natural and sustainable town. Rezoning public open space on Anstey Road to residential, including the currently rezoned lots 17 and 19, which contain significant environmental values, demonstrates a lack of understanding of sustainable development from the town and would not allow the town to achieve their adopted priority areas. Rezoning these lots to residential to provide financial ability to create public open space elsewhere is a further demonstration of poor sustainable development. So as I briefly mentioned, I would like to highlight amongst some other areas some of the significant environmental values of lots 17 to 23 Anstey Road that may not have been considered by the town of Bassendean in the past and which may have led to the erroneous rezoning of lots 17 and 19 Anstey Road and the contemplation in the draft local planning scheme to rezone lots 21 and 23 Anstey Road to residential. So I'd just like to highlight potential matters of national environmental significance as listed under the EPBC Act 1999. So there's potential, the following matters are likely to occur or may occur within the area. So that's 2 threatened ecological communities, 41 threatened species, 25 listed migratory species. And I'd further like to add that lots 17 to 23 are on vegetated land that is a natural low point or depression, allowing flood or storm water to migrate into groundwater in flood or storm events. Building and developing this land will alter the hydrological regime, preventing such migration into groundwater in actual or potential flood events, creating additional risk to current and future residents, including their health and safety. Finally, the potential costs associated with the preliminary site investigation and the detailed site investigation in accordance with the Contaminated Sites Act 2003 to understand and delineate the potential presence of and the horizontal and vertical extent of contamination on the lots could be substantial, and this is prior to understanding any potential costs for remediation. So to conclude, the most sustainable outcome for the town, which would allow it to achieve their strategic goals, would be to return lots 17 and 19 Anstey Road to public open space and to retain lots 21 and 23 as public open space. The significant values of the land would remain intact, be recognised and be preserved and viable for all to enjoy as it should be to date and for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Yes, sir.
Geez, that's a tough one to follow that, mate. Good evening, everybody. My name's Paul Allenby from 22 Highland Street in Bassendean. And we do have some concerns over the proposed local planning scheme number 11, specifically items 8.1 and 8.2. And my wife prepared an email for the council yesterday that we don't believe that there's been full consideration to the environmental factors, as Colin's alluded to. 2017 Bindaran Park, there was a fauna assessment done, and it notes 179 fauna species, of which 37 are of conservation significance. 45 species living within Bindaran Park are referenced on the federal government database as threatened. Considerations to fragmenting any part of the Bindaran Park and surrounding areas should be carefully reviewed and assessed to mitigate biological impacts. Aligning with the town of Bassendean's intent to conserve, protect and enhance our natural environment and biodiversity, value, conserve and protect our water resources and waterways and support the creation of a more green and shaded town. Development of any POS in Bassendean should be diligently considered, as once developed, you can't really undo what's been done. So once it's done, it's done. With respect to lots 17 to 23 Anstey Road, they are within the floodplain. The area is low-lying compared to neighbouring lots. The last reported modelling of the land was completed 5 years ago, noting a natural depression. And I can attest from personal experience, having rescued a bunch of kids on Sunday night who were bogged in the drain of the park, it's not particularly solid foundations. It is wet, it is muddy, it is boggy, and that's another matter that we'll be resolving. In 1983, lots 17 to 23 were all underwater, completely submerged. So where does the water go if we develop those plots of land and indeed put more houses on them? On a personal level, my wife and I chose to remain in Bassendean, where we've lived for a long, long time. For the community, for the natural spaces and the benefits that it brings to our family living in this beautiful council and town. We observe that so many other families and members of the community enjoy the public open spaces that we've got, and Bindaran Park is a key part of that public open space area. It differentiates us as a community, and I guess over and above everything else, we don't want to take action that we cannot undo. And once we develop that, it's done. Yeah, that's my statement.
Thank you. Yes, sir. If you come to the, is it a question or a statement, sir?
Statement.
Thank you.
I'm actually Moss Johnson, 6 Barton Parade, Bassendean. I'm going to reduce this statement because basically, in terms of regarding item 8.1, I want to just add my support to all of the statements that you've read out and all the statements that everybody else has read out. And I think that it is an opportunity when presenting the draft policy town planning scheme number 11, that rather than retaining lot 17 and 18 as R25, that we actually convert them to public open space. So that's on that one. On item 8.2, the areas marked in blue, the Highland Street, Anstey Road, and section of Carnegie Street. I feel that, well, there is the opportunity in the future that retaining them as public open space as part of the reserve just maintains the intent of the original scheme for a park that demonstrates the flow, the natural flow of the wetland as a watercourse. And I don't think that necessarily we have roads that go through national parks, and we have roads that go over bridges, and we have roads that have bicycle ways on them and so on, but there's still a road. And knowing that at the moment there's no financial appetite perhaps to do some radical thing of actually removing the roads, to me doesn't necessarily mean that the road shouldn't be part of the park. We have Whitfield Street. It's still a road, but it's designated differently, and that designation demonstrates the community's sense of priority towards that area. I think maintaining an idea that the important part of is the flow of the water, and the roads have been artificially put across it, is just demonstrates what our priorities are as a community. And I don't think it's important or necessary. It just seems, a waste of time to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
Paul Bridges, 150 West Road, Bassendean. Look, one of the things that I'd like to say, and complimenting all the speakers to date, the council should be projecting a vision for the future, and that's what the 4A scheme has done. Now, and the other thing about planning it is it's not to bring it back to what's on the ground today, but to what the vision that's projected for the future. Now, we're all ratepayers here, and so we don't want to have to incur great expense removing roads and taking road fill out, if it's straight out of our rates. But if you look at the new federal government and the whole approach that the Australian people have taken in this last federal election, it is to address climate change. And that's happened through the Labor Party, through the Greens, through the Teals, and an overwhelming amount of support has come for that position. Now, if you read the TAPs, and by the TAPs I mean the funding TAPs that will come on, it's a Monty that the federal government will then be looking to provide funding to ameliorate the impacts of climate change on the environment. Now, if we have a plan in place that's ready to go, when that tap turns on, we can apply for it. If we've got to turn around and recode a road reserve back to public open space and the time that takes, by the time all that's done, that funding round will have disappeared. And those that are prepared will have got the money. We need to think ahead, be prepared, get the planning in place. As soon as the funding's available, bang, there's our plan, there's our application. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Linda.
You got time for me?
I have indeed. Always time for you, Linda.
Well, I'll process it because everyone's said pretty much anything that needs to be said about this whole thing. But what can I say to add to it? We've got a drain there in case of flood or rising river levels that would probably save a lot of low-lying properties if it's allowed to drain properly. The drain on Harcourt Street, that's a drain, isn't where the drain is, that comes out, runs all year. And that drains from underneath of all of our houses. So if what's coming out of that is allowed to run through to the river, which if we get our plan in the end, and it's a continuous wetland from Harcourt down to the river, it could save us from flooding. And, you know, that's coming, rising river levels. It's coming. The hydrological study that was done points this out. So we've got mature trees and understory providing oxygen and cooling, providing an environment for biodiversity. In the light of the terrible environmental assessment that came out today, the government released today, we obviously need to work harder than ever to preserve any remnant of natural environment that remains. Bindaring Park and wetlands needs us to help it survive. And to do this, we need to retain the pieces of the park that have been whittled away. Those lots on Anstey Road that everyone's talked about need to be kept as part of the park and made as part of the park. The road in front of them can be at some stage removed. More drainage, and then Highland Street needs to be removed so that the park is a continuous wetland down to the river. I don't think this would cause anyone too much trouble, and it could do a lot to save our wetland. It's in a severely degraded state. Many of us have been working really hard for years to try and improve it, and in the recent years the council has come on board and helped us a lot as well. So we can continue to improve its ability to function as a wetland and as a piece of natural environment. Already I've seen in the last few years the biodiversity in that park is improving because we're not spraying, and we're planting lots of natural native things that are meant to be there, that the creatures, the reptiles and the insects and the birds need to make their homes in and to live on. So I ask you not to rezone the road reserves, the public open space roads into road reserves, and to please keep those lots on Anstey Road as public open space as well. And as Paul said, to keep an eye out for possible funding to make this happen. Because I think it could be, you know, really the jewel in the crown of this area if we can get it to function. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Okay, are there any other questions or statements before we, yes ma'am, come up to the microphone.
My name's Sophie Francis. I actually live at the top of Bassendean and Wilson Street, and I would just confirm everything that everyone said, but from a top of Bassendean perspective, where I'm seeing old blocks cleared completely of vegetation, we can't afford to put anything else under tarmac or under roof because we've got so little protection of the vegetation that's on private land that's just going under at a really exponential rate, that rezoning anything back into residential that the council owns would just be completely unethical at this particular point in time.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, if there are no other questions or statements, we will move on to.
Sorry, Catherine. The questions, are they now or later?
You can ask a question. It's
okay.
Question and statements are together.
They're together. Sorry, excuse my ignorance. So my husband and I had a few questions, 2 questions each.
Apologies for it.
Sorry, I'm new to all this. I don't understand the process, so please excuse my ignorance. I'm Jermaine Burke. I received an email through yesterday. I guess, Paul, did you want to come and join me and answer the first 2 questions? I just thought.
You're allowed.
Oh, we are. Sorry, is this okay? Yes. All right. Awesome. Thanks. Okay. So I'm not sure how all the process works, but I note on the agenda there were submissions from community that were noted on 8.2, the proposed road closures, but there wasn't any submissions noted, and I know there was some from back in April on agenda item 8.1. I'm just wondering why that was.
Okay, so the scheme is coming before council to go out for community advertising, for permission to go out for community advertising. Now, the approval of a draft scheme and strategy is a little bit of a long process that involves Department of Planning, and it requires us to, if we put any amendments in, it then goes back to the Department of Planning, and if they're not acceptable, it goes backwards and forwards. Mr. Gibson, would you like to add anything to that? It is actually meant to go out for community consultation, but this is just that first step for the community to actually get a cut of it.
Right, so I'm just hearing that they're both at two different stages of the communications. Okay, and my second question was, I note in the agenda minutes, there was a councillors workshop on the 14th of June regarding the local planning scheme number 11. Is it appropriate for you to share the outcomes of that workshop?
Okay,
specifically to I guess Vindaring. Yeah.
Okay, Jermaine, the workshops are not decision-making forums in any way, shape or form. What they are where ideas are bounced around. Sometimes the staff are looking for whether council is supportive of different things before they develop a program of works. It is a forum where staff and councillors interact to understand the direction that the administration might wish to take in certain things. Councillors might wish to add ideas. It's a workshop as per the name. So these workshops are not minuted. They're not decision-making forums. There are a host of different topics that come before workshops throughout the year. We have multiple workshops. So this was one topic that came before the workshop. There were discussions about different items in the town planning scheme, because clearly it's a document that has a host of different aspects to it.
So they were really, I guess, the actions or the next steps that came out of that workshop then? No, there was no actions or no next steps?
The plan is actually more or less the result of interactions between the town staff and the Department of Planning.
Through Madam Mayor, broadly the action that came out of the workshop is this report. Obviously, to simply load this report up to council sight unseen might have been a bit much to ask. There's obviously a lot of content there, and the workshop was used as a mechanism to basically introduce councillors into the different aspects of the scheme, seek a bit of feedback, as Madam Mayor has suggested, on things that could have gone either way, but broadly provide councillors with an update on the discussions that we'd had with the Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage in readiness for this evening and next Tuesday.
All right, thank you.
My question is, I sort of check this, why are you proposing rezoning and developing this land? And I think you've already said you're not proposing to rezone the land as such.
That's correct. All we're simply doing is carrying forward the designations of LPS 10 through to LPS 11. And as the report notes, it is open to council to do that, or it's open to council to do other things, and those other things could include all four being reserved or all four being zoned. But the proposal before council is to maintain the status quo unless council determines differently.
And we note has the 2017 Vandalism Park Assessment and Environmental Protection Act been considered prior to the proposed LPS recommendations?
Short answer would be no, on the basis that there's no proposed change to the status quo.
Thank you.
Mr. Bridges.
My question's really simple. Does this mean that at the next council meeting that this council could vote to rezone or to put forward lots number 17 and 19 as public open space?
Yes, Mr. Bridges.
Thank you.
If there's no change to the status quo, I was just wondering whether that 2017 report by Bamford for the Bingdarren Park was considered when you rezoned lots 17 and 19 to public open to residential.
Through Madam Mayor, we'd have to take that on notice. That happened a few years ago, so we'd have to look into that and provide a response later.
Okay, I strongly recommend you consider it if you have not.
Thank you. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, any more questions? Okay, we will move on to the reports. So councillors, there are no deputations tonight, thank you. Councillors, just to advise you that item 8.7 has been withdrawn from the agenda. So the first report is 8.1 and Mr. Gibson is standing in for the CEO who's absent tonight. Mr. Gibson, would you like to speak to this report?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. Probably don't need to say too much. I think everyone's across the proposal, and that is for Council to consider a draft local plan scheme number 11. There is a good deal of history to this significant body of work, which was covered in detail in a report presented to Council last month on the draft strategy. That history includes a special Council meeting in November 2020, where Council first resolved to initiate a new scheme. For ease of analysis, the Officer report identifies the key differences between the November 2020 version of the scheme and the current draft, and that analysis and comparison is contained on pages 7 and 8 of the agenda. The report also identifies two issues that have generated some very localised community interest, which we've just heard, both relating to Bingdarren Park. As the report sets out for these two elements, it's open to Council to maintain the position of the November 2020 version of the scheme, or alternatively propose a departure. It is ultimately recommended the Council adopt the scheme, noting of course that it still requires referral to the West Australian Planning Commission, the Heritage Council and the EPA for assessment prior to any public consultation.
Thank you. This part of the meeting is for councillors to ask questions of the administration, so community members cannot participate in questions from this point forward in the meeting. So councillors, who would like to ask a question? Councillor McWilliam.
Just, excuse me, in terms of the many natural events that have happened across Australia over the past few years, and most recently the terrible flooding that's occurred in the eastern states, and that used to occur in Bassendean, in Anstey Road and along North Road, and I remember that quite vividly, having lived in Anstey Road for much of my own life. And in view of this, and this is sort of something that I was pondering over today, when we look at the lots where there's going to be development, I wonder what the outcome of that will be. Does Council have a view as to how that might be managed? What would be the building restrictions on that? What would be the development that would have to occur? What would be the overflow, sorry for the pun, into drainage and other aspects that need to be considered? And what would happen to an area that is a rich flora and fauna?
So can we allow the officer to answer some of those questions?
This is simply a draft scheme. It is to zone and reserve land and set development controls. It is beyond the scope of this report to consider all those things. That would be best a discussion had as part of a review of the land asset strategy.
Just one other question.
Yes.
Also, a note in the news of late, nationally, is the call for development and local government and all of the other players that are involved in development as such, that they stop allowing the building in floodplains. And I wonder if there is any similarity between the situation that we're talking about today around Astor Road and Carnegie Street and Harcourt and so on, with the floodplain discussion that's occurred around North Road and West Road on the riverside and the other side actually.
In short, the land on Anstey Road is indeed in the floodplain, but draft state planning policy 2.9 provides that development can occur in those locations so long as there is sufficient clearance provided to the floor level, which is typically 0.5 metre, and there are many homes in that precinct already constructed on that basis. So if council wanted to maintain 1, 2, 3 or 4 of the lots as residential, the draft state planning policy would provide an avenue for that to be developed. But as I've said, it's open to council. If council did not wish to see that land developed, it would be open to council to either reserve the land as local open space or simply hold the land and not transact upon it, in which case it would remain in its current form.
One more, very quick.
I'm interrupting myself. Sorry. So the other thing that has become apparent is that people no longer have any faith in these 100-year flood events and whether these things hold any quality of reliance, that they're neither reliable nor actually accurate, and that the climate is changing and we're seeing different events. So is that part of the discussion, the thoughts that you would bring to bear through the local planning scheme, or is that something another area?
That is a decision for council.
Thank you.
Councillor McLennan.
Thank you. I guess I'm a bit concerned that we've got this many people in the room who are under the impression that the town is intending to rezone what's currently public open space to residential, and that's not what has been proposed. Has there been something that we have communicated to that has been misinterpreted, or is it just been a misreading of what's been put on the agenda?
Sorry.
We haven't communicated anything other than this?
Through you, Madam Mayor, I'm not sure. The documentation, the draft scheme map provided as part of the agenda.
But this is the extent of our public.
I would suggest a lot of the people here have become involved in the process by virtue of items 8.2 and 8.3, and that would have piqued interest in the scheme as well. But in terms of items 8.2 and 8.3, there was nothing as part of those proposals.
I mean specifically as part of the draft local plan scheme, where the proposal is not to rezone public open space to residential.
I think part of the confusion may be a previous version of a draft public open space strategy, perhaps.
Sorry, I can't hear when you're speaking.
A previous version of the draft public open space strategy may have provided for the lots to be urbanised, but that certainly wasn't endorsed by council and has therefore no status and is still in draft form. But certainly the plan before council tonight clearly identifies 2 of the lots being retained as open space and the 2 to the east being retained as residential R25. But as I say, it's certainly open to council to do something different.
Okay, thank you. And
sorry. Can I follow on from that? It's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Gibson, it's my understanding that the status quo of those blocks and what is presented has been the status quo for a very long time. Would that be correct? I certainly know that that was the 2 blocks as residential, 2 blocks as public open space was the status of those blocks when I was first elected to council. Do you have any idea of when that may have occurred? Because I think it was well before I became elected in 2017.
I don't, unfortunately, but that is something that I could easily find out during the week and provide an update to councillors accordingly.
Okay. Councillor McLennan?
Sorry, I know the Anstey Road lots are not the only part of the scheme, but obviously it's what people are interested in tonight. One of the comments that was made during public statement time was around maintaining the intent of, I can't remember where I put it, reuniting the wetland and removing the road. So we're talking about the portion of Anstey Road which is proposed to be retained as road reserve. From discussions that I've been involved in more recently, I understood that even though that would be a fantastic aspiration to have in line with the town planning scheme 4A intention, that the more recent regulations that have been introduced for bushfires now would prevent that. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Oh, that's correct. State Planning Policy 3.7, which is planning in bushfire prone areas, would apply. And there is a strong presumption against cul-de-sacs on the basis that it may limit emergency egress. And I suppose if these areas highlighted in blue on one of the plans were in fact removed and reinstated with vegetation, etc., and form part of the broader park, that would introduce some dead ends that are otherwise through roads. So that would be problematic. It's not to say it could not occur, but it would certainly be a risk on council to be removing through roads and replacing them with cul-de-sacs in a bushfire prone area.
Thank you.
Councillor Ames?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And great question, Councillor McLennan, to continue on with that. Regarding those current road reserves highlighted in blue, if we were to reunite them with public open space, they can still remain as they are. I would think, you don't have to actually remove the roads. As one of the residents is saying, we've got roads that go through state parks and national parks. We can zone them as public open space. Could they still be there presently to be used as road currently as it's used, but zoned in a different way?
So, Councillor Ames, that's 8.2 really.
It is, but I suppose, I think just for clarity, as the report at 8.2 suggests, it actually isn't a matter for 8.1. It's just that it was raised as part of the submissions in response to 8.2. Right. So they are interrelated. But the short answer would be yes, it's completely open for council to leave the local open space designation over the constructed portions of road reserve, and they will still operate as a constructed road. It is simply fixing up an oddity in the mapping, and it is consistent with council's November 2020 decision. But that said, it's open to this council to depart from that and do something different, and one of those things could be leaving the local open space designation over the top of those constructed roads.
Thank you.
Councillor Plivka?
Oh, yes, thank you. In terms of the process that we're going through with the scheme, it's an opportunity, though, for us to zone lots 17 and 19 as public open space. So that's something which can occur at the next meeting, I think, that you had said. In terms of that, as far as departures from the scheme that the WAPC has seen to date, I mean, that wouldn't really be considered a radical change that's going to cause any issues. So if we made that amendment, we're not going to get any pushback from the WAPC, I wouldn't imagine.
No, I think an amendment to add open space as opposed to adding residential would be reasonably innocuous in their eyes, given that it's owned by the town and we would be consenting to it. So if council was to make a departure from the November 2020 version of the scheme and the current LPS 10 to reserve all four as local open space, I don't suspect we'd encounter any issues with the department.
So no concerns on that front. In terms of the scheme 4A, and you might again have to take this on notice and provide the answer to us at a later stage. So lots 17 and 19, at the time the 4A scheme came into being, were they identified as lands that were to be resumed and to be set aside as public open space? So we're going back to 1980 before...
For you, Madam Mayor, yes, that would be one I'd need to take on notice.
So, but presumably there was a scheme map of some sort which would inform us as to what the intention was at that point in time. And in terms of the 4A scheme as well, just to get an understanding of how that operated, and I apologise to those here that probably have lived that experience and know a lot more about it. But with the 4A scheme, so lands were compulsorily acquired from residents in exchange for remuneration, of course, but lands which fell within that area.
Whether or not they were acquired compulsorily, I'm not sure. They were certainly acquired because we know the town owns them. Whether it was undertaken as a compulsory acquisition process, I'm not sure.
Okay. And finally, in terms of development in that area, did the town ever levy, I suppose, public open space contributions on people within that scheme area?
Yes, certainly. It's a resumptive scheme. There are cost contributions payable per dwelling unit upon construction.
And so those people that had contributed towards that scheme on the basis that the wetlands would be preserved in that way might have had that expectation that that would occur?
Quite likely, yes.
Nothing further.
So, councillors, with your indulgence, I just want to backstep a little bit to the 3.7 bushfire process that you mentioned. Can I ask, Harcourt Street, number 20 and 22, and then you've got lot 17 Devon Road, which goes all the way through to Harcourt Street. Last I heard, those lots, when they're subdivided, are not going to get a double two-way road. They're just going to get a single road to allow access to those properties. Is that correct?
Sure.
Okay, so that's on notice. I would be curious how that could happen with those blocks in respect to 3.7 Bushfire Act. Now, the other question about the bushfire issue, there would be, if projecting forward, and I have no idea what a future council might do, but if those, or one or any of those roads were removed, would not the existing roads to those houses provide emergency access and egress and what have you? And if you were looking for access to the bushland itself, could that not be provided as it is in other bush areas via a fire track?
As I said before, it could be done, but it would be a risk on council. And I think before council made any decisions on that, it would be well advised that council seeks advice from LGIS as to whether the risk would be something that is appropriate to entertain. Each property would need at least one legal access. The issue that's covered by the SPP is that access could be the access that is effectively blocked off by a bushfire event. And that is why there is a strong presumption in the state planning policy to have two emergency egress points. Those properties in the area currently enjoy two egress points by virtue of the constructed roads in question. If council was to remove those roads, limiting emergency egress, that would be a risk, I'd suggest, on council.
I just need a little bit of clarity there, if you don't mind. Two egress, so a two-lane road does not provide that in front of a property, is that right? Or it does?
It's not the number of lanes, it's the exit directions.
Exit directions, okay. Okay. Councillors, I have a few other questions about other things in the town planning scheme, but if anybody wishes to continue in this vein, I'll let you speak first. No, okay. Page 7 of the agenda mentions right-of-way ceding of land, and I just wanted to understand that. In that I did not participate in the right-of-way item during discussions. I absented myself from that. And the ceding of land, I understood from conversations that you had indicated that there were alternatives available rather than residential properties ceding land to the town free of charge. Can I just have a bit of clarity around that in the town planning scheme?
There's certainly potential alternatives, and as we said at the time of council determining the right-of-way strategy, the acceptability of those alternatives will largely rest with the department as to whether they would potentially cede under-width rights of way. So the provision that's being referred to at the bottom of page 7 there is simply to say that if a planning framework, whether it's a policy or a local development plan or a precinct structure plan, if a council adopted framework identifies the need for widening, that there is a provision in the scheme that provides the head of power for that widening. That's not to say that at the moment we don't have any frameworks that provide for widening, so the provision would be largely redundant in the first instance. But if at some point in the future council adopts a framework that provides that widening is necessary, and that may well be the case if the department does not let the town, does not allow for the dedication of under-width rights of way, that provision would be useful in that instance. But it is not suggesting we have any short-term proposal to widen any of the rights of way, because council, in determining the strategy, decided against that.
Okay. With your indulgence, I have another question. On page 8 of the agenda, it mentions in the graph section that planning areas C, D, E, F and G, until relevant investigations have been completed, they're going to remain as split density codings. And I just wanted to know what will be the relevant investigations, what will that entail, and how long would that process take? And I'm sorry if I'm asking the length of a piece of string.
No, that's okay. In terms of the timeframes, yeah, that's obviously a difficult one to answer. As you can see, or as you would have seen from the draft local planning strategy previously, or last month, the highest priority task for the strategy is number 1, this scheme, and number 2, the precinct structure plan for the Bassendean town centre. So we're hopeful the scheme will run its course and not take too much longer. But certainly the precinct structure plan for the Bassendean town centre will be a significant body of work, which means everything after that will be in the medium term at best.
Okay.
In terms of what the process would be, it would likely be an amendment to the local planning scheme, and that amendment would be supported by an investigation by the town as to the desired housing typologies, the desired residential densities, any structural or development controls that are needed to actually deliver those desired housing types. But the actual planning process would be an amendment to the then local planning scheme number 11.
Okay, thank you. You answered my next question. Okay, on page 14 of the attachment, the zone chart, I just have one minor question there. The residential building was a discretional use under residential. I actually wondered whether that was a typo or not.
No, it's certainly open currently for those councillors. Page 12 of the attachment. It's a discretionary use, which means it is not permitted unless the local government has exercised its discretion by granting development approval. A residential building is not a typical single house.
Okay.
That is covered elsewhere. So a residential building, the town in the last 3 years hasn't received any applications for a residential building. It's not a typical housing format.
Okay, and also on that graph is waste disposal facilities and waste storage facilities listed as an A in industrial areas. Why would that not be an X in all areas? Out of curiosity.
advice from the department is you can't have a use prohibited in all zones. But it's certainly open to council to make it prohibited in light industry and make it an A use in general industry, if council has a particular view about those zone uses.
Can I just clarify though, would a waste disposal facility, I haven't looked at the definition recently, would that also include things like a recycling facility and?
It also includes some,
No, I understand.
yeah, the incinerators too. That's why I asked.
It's certainly open to council, as with all aspects of the scheme, to make changes, but advice from the department is that each listed use must be at least permissible, or not permissible, able to be contemplated in at least one zone.
Councillors, I do have some other questions, but if anybody else would like to ask questions, otherwise I'll be very quick. Okay, page 23.2 on the attachment is about the planting ratio for developed blocks. So we've got a planting ratio of 350 metres. It's in the attachment. Sorry, I went on the computer, so yeah. So we've got 350 metres in that scheme at the moment. Can I ask what may be the issues if council wanted to reduce that down to a planting ratio of, say, 1 tree per 250 square metres? Would that be problematic in respect to the Department of Planning?
Not necessarily. I believe the Department of Planning would be comfortable enough for the town to advertise that. Whether or not they would ultimately recommend to the minister that it be gazetted as part of the ultimate scheme, that's a matter yet to be tested. The 1 tree per 350 square metres matches the local planning policy. If council was wanting to change that, that is certainly something within council's power, and any change to the scheme would obviously prompt staff to revisit the local planning policy shortly thereafter.
Okay, councillors, Councillor Plivka.
Just following on from that, if we were able to achieve, I suppose, those more stringent planting requirements, so you had the 1 per 250 square metres, just how it would work in respect of established properties. So it would be that for every, if there was a significant tree, they would need to seek council permission, I think is my understanding, is what the scheme would achieve in order to remove a significant tree. What would the interaction be between the removal of the tree where somebody has a surplus of significant trees, so a surplus over the 250 square metres? So if we went to that stricter requirement, how would that work for community members? How would they manage that?
They would operate independently. If someone had a series of trees in their property and they were significant trees and they were therefore not exempt from the requirement to obtain development approval to remove them, they would need to lodge an application for development approval. Part of the assessment of that application would be against the policy as to the number of trees they would need if they redevelop the site, and we would, as I imagine, use that as a guide.
So I guess they would be related in that way then, in that they would be able to potentially remove up to that amount, so they couldn't have less than what we were mandating. So if we mandated the 250,
they certainly could have less if council approved less. They could lodge it. They could lodge if they had 10 trees in their property, and the policy required 2 trees. They could apply to remove 8 trees, or they could apply to remove 10 trees. It would be up to council to determine that application.
We do have council to safeguard against that sort of thing, but just as an accounting purpose to show that if those applications were occurring, we would be better suited if we had that stricter requirement of 1 per 250, so that we could, I suppose, mount an argument to say, well, you can't have less than 1 per every 250 square metres.
That could certainly inform council's decision making on any application for development approval to remove a significant tree. Yes.
And potentially to ensure that any of our decisions would be unassailable through other avenues, should a resident be dissatisfied.
A resident always has the right of appeal to SAT.
Thank you.
Thank you, councillors. Are there any other questions? Okay, on that note, we'll move to item, we've already covered 8.2, but I just want to check before we move on if there's any more questions about 8.2. Okay, so we'll move to 8.3, which is proposed road closures, Hamilton Street Reserve and surrounds.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This item is quite similar, I suppose, in content to item 8.2, but a different geographical location, of course. And it's asking Council to consider the potential closure of portions of road in and around Hamilton Street Reserve. The proposal was advertised and the town received 2 submissions, both in support of the proposal. As the report notes, staff have since reviewed or re-reviewed the proposal and considered it appropriate to slightly reduce the extent of the closure, just to align with an abutting residential property on the bottom end of Hamilton Street. Otherwise, it's recommended the council support the amended closure and authorise the staff to make the request to the Minister for Lands.
Councillors, any questions? Okay, so we'll move on to 8.4, addition to local heritage list. So again.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The purpose of this report is for Council to consider amending the town's heritage list by adding a new place, being 150 West Road in Bassendean. In May, just gone, Council resolved to adopt an amended local heritage survey, which included a change for the subject site being an upgrade in management category from 3 to 2. Typically, category 1 and 2 places of the local heritage survey are included on the heritage list, which provides for additional statutory protection. Given the change to the local heritage survey, a subsequent change to the heritage list is warranted. This change is supported by the landowner, who's with us tonight, and the proposal is not at all contentious.
Thank you. Councillor Plewka.
Just a question on the naming of 8.4 and 8.5. So for 8.4 we say addition to local heritage list. 8.5 we say amendment to local heritage survey. Is there any difference, or it's just we're doing the same thing for each of those?
Just interchangeable terms,
Okay.
doing much the same.
Great, thanks.
Any other questions, councillors? Okay, we'll move on to 8.5, amendment to local heritage survey.
This amendment is to add 2 places, and those 2 places are Sandy Beach and Ashfield Flats. This was progressed at the request of Council for a discussion that occurred in May OCM. Whilst both places are state land, the landowner, being the West Australian Planning Commission, has no objection to a listing, and as such, again, the proposal is not considered contentious.
Okay. Any questions, councillors? Okay, we'll move on to 8.6, draft local planning policy short stay accommodation.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The purpose of this report is for Council to consider adopting a draft local planning policy for the purpose of advertising, with the policy being requested by Council earlier this year. The draft policy was provided to councillors approximately 3 weeks ago with no comments or queries being received. It should be noted that it is the recommendation is simply that Council adopt it for the purpose of advertising, and as with other policies that Council has seen recently, Council will have another opportunity to consider the policy again in light of any submissions received.
Any questions, Councillor Plewka?
Just a question on the consistency between our various policies. So we have the differential rates on residential property, and one of the reasons we did that was to encourage the development of dwellings in the town so that we could address a rental shortage. Have we considered the interplay between short-term accommodation and its effect on the availability of rental properties in the district?
Not particularly, no. This is a local planning policy given local planning matters. The availability of rental accommodation for on the scope of the planning system. But it's open to Council if it wants to facilitate a particular outcome for the policy to be geared accordingly.
I mean, if a property could suit either of those purposes and one were more lucrative, such as the short-term accommodation I think has been reported to be, then it would only be natural for people to want to maximise the potential of their property, and so those properties that might otherwise have been available for people to rent on a longer-term basis would just be short-term accommodation.
Quite possibly, and if that was a concern of council, it would be open to tighten up the control of the policy to limit the opportunities for short stay accommodation. One of the provisions of most relevance is the locational criteria around railway stations. And if council wanted to limit the geographical location, it could reduce that radius.
I suppose people also like to live next to railway stations if they're renting, so and that could go either way, that argument potentially.
And that would be a consideration for councillors. To what extent does it want to facilitate the short stay accommodation use, and if it wants to facilitate it in some capacity, where is council thinks that's okay?
Thank you.
Councillor McLennan.
I just had a question about a number of the clauses. So under the assessment criteria 6.3b, it refers to the site having direct access to a constructed road that has 2 exit routes, excluding situations where the sole access of the premises is provided from a cul-de-sac right-of-way or battle access leg. So does that mean that if the property was on a cul-de-sac or a battle axe, it would be excluded, or are you saying that they would be permitted because that's...
Through you, Madam Mayor, that they would be ineligible unless council granted the variation of policy.
So any battle axe property or a cul-de-sac would be ineligible.
Correct.
And what was the rationale behind that thinking?
There's probably a couple of elements there. There's obviously emergency egress, which was raised before, particularly when people are unfamiliar with an area. But there's also the view, and this is open to council to accept this or otherwise, that the impact of short stay accommodation might be more profoundly felt in a cul-de-sac or battle axe arrangement. So it's largely a protection of amenity matter.
Thank you. At 6.4, you list conditions that the town may impose. I'm imagining that if this policy was adopted in some form like this, that they would be conditions that would be generally imposed in most cases. Would that be how it would be approached, or how would the staff determine when they would or wouldn't be imposed?
Each application is required to be assessed on its merits, and I suppose the appropriateness of those listed conditions, and that's not an exhaustive list by any stretch, it's just simply a sample of what might be the most common protections against amenity issues. The time-limited approval, for example, wouldn't necessarily apply in all instances, but it would be a tool available to the town and council where an application could be acceptable, but there's a bit of uncertainty, whereas an application may well be in another location where it's quite acceptable and could be approved unconditionally from a timeframe point of view. 6.4a, for example, I'd imagine would be applied every time, unless there was some reason to depart from that may be otherwise covered in a management plan or similar. It would be open to council to say that the town shall impose those conditions if the council wanted those conditions applied in every instance.
So I've got a couple more if that's all right.
Sorry?
I've got a couple more if that's okay. Some time ago, I forwarded through a policy, I think it was Bassendean maybe, that had recently adopted one, and I note that a number of these conditions and provisions are similar to what were imposed there around the curfews. One of the things that I saw in their policy was around how dogs that came onto holiday accommodation like this were managed. Has that been an issue at all in the town for any short stay accommodation?
Not since I've been in the town. That said, we don't get a large volume of applications for this land use. It would be open to council to amend the policy, or staff could simply consider that as part of the assessment of the applications. But certainly, through the week, staff can review those provisions and determine whether it's appropriate to include in the draft policy.
And so just one last one. Councillor Prolifica was referring to the potential to tighten up the policy so as to restrict the number of short stay accommodation locations that could be approved within the town. if there was already an existing one that had approval within the town, that approval would remain valid unless they were changing the conditions?
Correct, unless they were changing an element of it, or if it may have been a time limited approval and that time expired, they would need to obtain a fresh approval.
Great, thank you.
Councillor Carter.
Oh, thank you. Under 6.4A, you mentioned a single family. Does that just be a nuclear family, parents and children, or could it be multi-generational, like grandparents, parents, children? A single family is not really defined, as far as
No,
I
and
can
I
see.
suppose if council had a particular view on that, we could better define it, but I think staff would take a reasonably liberal view on that, given that it's ultimately capped at six people. So even if it was a multi-generational family and it's capped at 6 people, that's really the issue, is the number of people, not so much the family structure.
I couldn't cap my family at 6. Yeah.
Bring your whole family.
20. It's my grandparents, children and grandchildren.
Okay. Councillor Ames.
Thanks, Madam Mayor. Through to Mr Gibson. Following on from Councillor McLennan's comment, do you know how many short stay accommodations we have within the town at this point in time?
I do not, but I can recall over the last 3 years that we've probably only had one application which was refused by council. But there may well be, undoubtedly there's approvals that have existed for my time at the town, but certainly it's not an application or a proposal that comes across our desks all that frequently.
And to follow on from that conversation, this particular policy, we're talking about a previous application, would not see that particular venue be approved from some of the dot points within this policy. Is that correct?
It's correct to say that the previous proposal that this council has considered would not comply with the policy, but that said, it would obviously be open to council, and council would be obliged to consider it on its merits, having due regard for the policy, and it would be open to council to depart from the policy or strictly apply the policy.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Councillors.
I was just going to ask about benchmarking for every application, how many uses are there, but it would appear that there are at least 39.
There may well be 39. I don't think we've issued 39 approvals.
Yes, Councillor Ames.
We've got a can of worms on the northern side of the chamber tables, but thanks very much. So we have information that is publicly available. This particular policy gets passed by council. What's the town or the council's, I suppose, next step forward to be able to apply the policy to public information? Is it a matter of we are required to do that? If we can find that there are short stay accommodations that maybe not apply with this policy, I'm just sort of putting on information here. What's the town's responsibility, or the council's responsibility, or the administration's responsibility if this policy gets up based on what public available information there is?
This policy doesn't change the requirement for a landowner to obtain development approval. That requirement exists now, and it will still exist after the council adopts this policy. So the policy doesn't change the need for development approval. Obviously, we could probably suppose, or we could probably infer that a number of operators haven't obtained development approval, but that would not be uncommon across the metropolitan area, and these things are generally identified by way of complaint to the local government. And I would suggest, from a pragmatic point of view, that we would maintain that stance. And just as anyone could have complained to the town last month, they'll be able to complain to the town next month, and the need for development approval would be the same. The only difference would be if and when we received an application, we'd have a policy to assess the work with.
Sure.
Thank
you. Yeah, just on that complaints-based policing approach, does that present any difficulties for us? I mean, is there any potential liability? I mean, could someone say, well, you had an obligation to ensure this didn't occur? Or
I suppose the assertion could always be levelled, but not that approach is not at all dissimilar to every other local government.
Well, I certainly would agree with that. It seems to be the way.
Yeah, where it's a complaints-driven exercise, and if someone's operating, albeit without a development approval, but not harming the amenities such that the neighbours don't mind, the general rule of thumb is to let sleeping dogs lie. And however, if the use is such that it compromises the amenity, that will generally prompt a complaint. And every local government has some form of compliance arm, and a process ensues from there. And it may well be the use stops, or the landowner lodges an application for development approval after the fact, and has it determined. I don't think we would be at risk of any criticism or other action by maintaining that approach.
So potentially self-moderating, when people keep their heads down, make sure that their guests behave so that they don't become the subject of the wrath of the town.
And broadly, the policy is seeking to ensure this land use, if it's to operate, operates in a compatible manner. So if it is already operating in a compatible manner such that there's no complaints, whilst, yes, there is a technical breach, it doesn't seem to be harming the amenity of the local area.
Thanks.
So councillors, if there's no more questions, we'll move on to 8.8 because 8.7 has been withdrawn. So 8.8.
Is 8.7 going to come back to us at some stage? Okay.
I don't believe so. Would you like to provide?
I can do, Madam Mayor. So we had a situation where council resolved to pursue a certain action on the right of way, which was to split it amongst two landowners. That was progressed by staff. The Valuer General's office undertook a valuation, provided that to each of the landowners. One landowner was satisfied, the other was dissatisfied. So effectively we had an impasse on that proposal. So to provide an opportunity to move forward, a report was prepared. But very, very late this afternoon, the landowner has advised that they will now be accepting the valuation and will purchase it, thereby allowing us to implement council's original resolution.
Thank you.
So councillors, 8.8 is tree vandalism policy, and Nicole Davey will speak to this.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So a review has been undertaken of the tree vandalism policy, and that was adopted by Council in 2018 and is due for review this year. So there's areas within the current policy that provide high-level guidance are recommended to be retained with some amendments. This includes the investigation, regulation and enforcement section, and also replacement of vandalised trees. There were some elements that was seen to be more relevant to include in a plan or an internal investigation procedure, and they're proposed to be removed from the council policy. That includes the sections to do with community education, monitoring and prevention, the tree vandalism reward, promotion of the policy, and also Appendix 1, which is a prescribed form for recording information on how the vandalism was investigated. Councillors are currently advised of any tree vandalism through the bulletin, and that process is proposed to continue and is considered to be appropriate.
Councillors, questions? Councillor McLennan.
Thank you. You look very lonely over there tonight. I need to go to the next report. I had a couple of questions. So in the report, you mentioned that in the current policy, there were a number of aspects that were not considered to be current best practice. What were the aspects that have been identified?
Not so much not best practice, but I think the financial penalties components, we've found that some other legislation may be more applicable, especially for trees within parks and reserves. And also the ability to recoup some of the costs that were in the current policy might be quite difficult to enforce. So we've proposed just some amendments to those aspects.
So what would the situation be under this proposed policy if somebody did vandalise a tree? We could prove that they had done that. How you've mentioned in here the activities on thoroughfares and trading local law. And also the monetary value placed on the tree from the assessment. So if somebody was we were able to prove that somebody had intentionally vandalised the tree, what kind of penalty would we be expecting somebody to be liable for?
So if it was an infringement, I believe the value is around $500, and then the other alternative is to prosecute. That would be if action was taken under legislation. If there was a significant tree with a high amenity value, that could be quite a high cost that we would attempt to recoup through either civil action or just requesting payment.
But if it wasn't, a really significant tree, but it was still something, a 20-year-old tree that was providing significant amenity, the individual could just be faced with a $500 ballpark figure fine. Is that correct?
The amenity value can be quite high, even for just a standard tree.
Oh, sorry, I wasn't very clear. I mean, if it was just an infringement, if we didn't pursue.
Yes, that's correct, but I don't believe that differs from the current situation.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And so one more question. In terms of operationalising a lot of the things that are currently in the existing policy, a number of the things in the existing policy you mentioned, a reward and the signage, it would be the intention to be to remove those from the practice that the staff would undertake?
Generally, yes. I don't believe those aspects of the policy have been implemented or actioned, at least for the past several years, in terms of the tree vandalism signage being installed for 3 years or for the town offering rewards for information.
Thank you. Sorry, can I follow on from that? You're finished, Councillor.
Yes, that's fine.
Yeah. The signage, so we've not been putting the signage up when we've had trees vandalised in the last couple of years, is that right?
Not to the knowledge of the current staff who are involved with investigating those issues.
We would still have those signs down at the depot, I would think. Yes? No?
I'd have to take that question on notice. I'm not sure what the signs were.
The only reason I ask is because the signage do you think the signage prompts people to be more aware of vandalism in their area?
Yes, it would highlight that as an issue, and it could still be considered as appropriate in some situations. So it wouldn't, it's just the current policy suggests that in every instance of vandalism where there's significant damage or if a tree is removed, signs would be installed and left there for 3 years. And so we don't believe that's always appropriate. There might be some situations where it is, but not always.
Councillors. Councillor Plivka.
Yeah, no, I was just trying to find a photograph. I think I had seen one of those signs in the past 3 years, maybe somewhere near Surrey Street from memory.
Or corner of West Road and Reed Street.
The last one was the corner of West Road and Reed Street. That's the last one I remember.
Yeah, but I think it was reasonably recent, and the sign did look to be in fairly good condition, so it must have been commissioned quite recently, I would have thought. So maybe they are in the depot.
Yeah, I think it was probably removed 2 years ago when the property was purchased and redeveloped. Yeah. So, anyway, councillors, do we have any other questions on this policy? Okay. So we'll go to 8.9, and I just wanted to draw your attention to what looks like a typo. Here we go. So it's on page 37 of the agenda, and the December dates look like they're incorrect. So particularly the ordinary council meeting and the 13th of December is actually a Wednesday, so that should be the 12th, I believe.
Mine says the 12th of December.
Sorry? Oh, maybe I looked at the wrong calendar.
Oh, you're looking at briefing session. Yeah.
The ordinary council meeting under December on page 37 of the hard copy agenda actually has 12th of December, which is the day before the briefing. Yeah, so I think that might be a typo. Can I also ask about
Yes, just the December ones.
Can I also ask about the proposed November dates? You've got 15th of November for the briefing and the 21st of November for the ordinary council meeting. Would there be any problems if they were the third week as normal, which is 21st of November for the briefing and 28th of November for the OCM? And the only reason I ask that is because that's the first council meeting for a brand new council. And it seems to me to give them that extra week to bed in might be advantageous.
Yes.
Okay, so we can discuss it anyway. It's just, I'm just highlighting that that might be something to consider. And I think that's it for that one. Any other questions, councillors? Okay, so we move on to 8.10, which is the Bassendean Local Emergency Management Committee. And I don't know if there's any comment on that one. Okay, any questions, councillors? Okay, so we will move on from that one. We're on to the notices of motion, of which there are 4. Any questions on any of those notices of motion? The first one is a briefing session. No. The second one is Arts, Culture and Events Committee. No. Next one is the Joint Standing Committee, CATS Local Law. No questions. And the last one is the use of glyphosate. Councillor, okay, Councillor McWilliam and then Councillor Ames.
So, Madam Mayor, just drawing attention to the spelling of glyphosate, which is correct all through the body, but in the headings, you can just read to glyphosate, which is
okay.
Just a small point. Well made.
As good as me with my typos. Okay, Councillor Ames.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well picked up, Councillor McWilliam. Just got a question, and I'm not sure if I direct it through to yourself, Mr. Gibson, or through to Councillor Carter.
Through me to Councillor Carter.
Okay, cool. So through you, Madam Mayor, to Councillor Carter, your notice of motion that says the council does not permit the use of glyphosate in or near children's playgrounds and other public places in the town where children congregate. Is there a radius or a distance that you have in mind that would be appropriate? Because near for some individuals could be between you and me, or near could still be 50 metres based on the application purpose of the particular pesticide. So I think having a very stringent thought process around that as to what is near. Is it within the boundaries of a sand pit? Is it within X metres of? Because I think subjectively near could mean different things to different people. So I'm not sure if that was a sort of conversation for councillors or for administration, or if you'd like to amend your motion moving forward for next week.
Through you, Madam Mayor, it's a very good point, Councillor Ames, and it's one I've sort of struggled with for a bit because there are lots of different views on this, and I was rather hoping we could sort of build a conversation. But if you like, I will put a distance or a figure to it, if that's feasible.
So you'll amend it?
In time for that. It will just be, can I just...
I note that we are still awaiting an officer response to this one as well. So it may be that you might wish to consider that once you've got the officer response.
That would be Would that give me enough time?
You may move an amendment on the night if you wish, but I'd prefer to know in advance
Yes,
if
of
possible.
course.
So, any other questions, councillors? Councillor McLennan?
Can I go back to the previous one just quickly?
You can.
Only to bring people's attention to a very minor change. I just noticed that the most up-to-date version wasn't one that was included in the agenda, so I'll send that through, and it was essentially just to include the local member and the Minister for the Environment in our advocacy around this issue.
Councillor Plivka?
Just a question on that. So 1C says restrict all cats in the district to their owner's premises. Say you've got neighbours and a neighbour's cat goes back and forth and vice versa. I mean, if you had that arrangement with your neighbour, would we be able to facilitate that somehow so your cats could visit your neighbour's property?
Cat thoroughfares.
Holding the wall.
Because I mean, the literal reading of that is it has to stay within your premises, but cats.
Can I respond?
Yes.
So the motion isn't proposing that we actually change our local law. It is proposing that these provisions be possible. And I'm sure the neighbour, if they're happy, if they like the cat, they're not going to complain about it. So we've got to revert back to what Mr. Gibson was referring to earlier about complaints triggering action.
Not a problem.
Councillors, I understand that this is of interest to a gentleman in the audience who's having trouble hearing. So councillors, are there other questions on this item? No, okay. I do believe that we are having a deputation next week, if I'm correct. Yes, okay. So